Okay, welcome to the North Central Climate Science Center's monthly check-in. This month we are lucky enough to have Elizabeth McNie, or Bets, giving us kind of an overview of some terminology and analysis she's done for quite a few years, adding up kind of like how we go kind of from science to usable science in that spectrum, so to speak. Bets is also with the Western Water Assessment and collaborating in some of the work we've done with them. And it will be helping the North Central Climate Science Center in our evaluation of stakeholder use of the Climate Science Center for that 5-year review that will happening. So Bets has been kind of, for better or worse, Bets, you're kind of joined at the hip with us for a little bit now, and I think it's timely to see kind of what you're talking about with respect to usable science and informing decisions. So with that, let me hand it over to you, Bets, and I'll just advance the slides for you.
Okay, great. Go ahead and advance. All right, so if we're looking at science as a way to solve problems, then we have to ask ourselves, what is the goal? And the goal, in many cases, for what we're doing science for, is to solve discrete problems, to reduce vulnerabilities and improve resilience to climate change in particular. Next slide. So people calling for usable science are across the board, from the World Bank to the IPCC. There's been a lot of research done on usable science and actionable science, transdisciplinary research. These are all sort of kissing cousins to each other, but they all sort of come to the same conclusion that if our goal is to produce useful climate science to reduce vulnerabilities and improve resilience, then we need to do things a little bit differently. Next slide. So what we need is more useful information to help solve these discrete problems that we're faced with. And useful information can be thought of as having 3 characteristics. One is that it's salient, credible, and legitimate. And this is how we define useful information. By salient, we mean that it's context sensitive, it's specific to the problem at hand, it's at the right scale, it's at in the right time frame, et cetera. And it's credible. Credibility refers to whether the science itself has been done in a credible way, in a way that makes sense, in a way that's accepted. And so most of the times we use peer-reviewed publications as a means of determining whether something is credible or not. But it can also come from other sources. It could be a white paper. It could be a meeting, et cetera. But the question is, people need to believe that the information was produced in a credible way. And finally, useful information is legitimate. And this is probably the hardest part to understand because it's counterintuitive when we talk about facts. But legitimacy refers to whether the users of the information believe that the information is produced with their best interests in mind and produced free from political persuasion or bias. So these 3 characteristics of useful information exist, they coexist. And you cannot simply say, well, we don't have legitimacy, so we're going to up the salience a little more. Or we're not very salient, but damn it, they believe us. So what these 3 characteristics have to do is exist simultaneously in a balanced way in order for information to be useful. Useful information expands alternatives and clarifies choices. So together they help inform decisions broadly construed. And by decisions, it could be a policy, it could also be an individual farmer or land manager making a decision, et cetera. Next slide. So what we're finally talking about is doing science in a different way, which is the design and implementation of research that actively links science with policy. And this is different from just doing basic research. It's different from even doing a lot of applied research in which stakeholders are not engaged with the process, et cetera. Next slide. So the problem if the goal is to produce actionable science, then the problem is that there are a lot of missed opportunities for the science to be useful. And go ahead and click on this a couple times, Jeff. There you go. Okay. Most approaches to research supports the successful production of knowledge related to all facets of the natural, physical, and social world. Right? This is what research is. It's about contributing to our knowledge base, you know, putting information into the vast reservoir of knowledge, waiting for it to be used at another time. But this process that is best characterized by basic research and a lot of applied research is that it is ill-suited in its present structure to help solve the most pressing problems because of these missed opportunities. And as the National Research Council says, when science is gathered to inform environmental decisions, it is often not the right science. Next slide. This drawing sort of characterizes, I think, what is a common misunderstanding among many scientists, not all, but that if you talk to researchers, people believe in their research. I mean, they have to. We put all this time into it and this energy into it. We have vested interest and we love it. But people think that it's inherently relevant and useful. That's not usually the case when we're talking about solving discrete kind of problems. There is an overlap where it is useful, but there's lots of opportunities where we could move those two bubbles together and have greater overlap. And that's where doing research differently comes into play. Next slide. Next. There we go. So the problem is that these missed opportunities, well, what are they? Well, the first and biggest missed opportunity is that the research often lacks context. So it's the wrong scale, the wrong problem, it's not timely. It's, you know, the right time for the wrong situation, so to speak, looking at the pictures on the right side. The information fails to integrate multiple disciplines, and especially the physical, natural, and social sciences. So this is sort of a nod to the need to be more multidisciplinary or even transdisciplinary in how we approach problem solving. The problem is that most research also ignores other forms of knowledge and expertise. And, you know, to just take the most obvious example in your backyard, the work that you're doing on the Wind River Reservation brings to light the importance of recognizing other forms of knowing and other forms of expertise in order to develop relevant drought information for the reservation. It's not just about what the experts know. You have to acknowledge that there are other experts in the room. And this is a big problem, is that a lot of researchers tend not to do this. It's also difficult to use, understand, or apply scientific knowledge with existing knowledge systems. So there's little care taken to understand how that information is going to be integrated into a bigger situation. And that's, you know, particularly problematic when we start talking about, you know, specific management plans or specific models or operating systems, et cetera. And finally, the information may not be relevant to the decision process and fails to integrate information into the decision process. Next slide. So, challenge, why is creating useful scientific information so hard? I mean, we're a smart bunch of people. This shouldn't be rocket science. And there are several reasons for this. One is that there's what we call the science-society gap. Science operates independently from society, largely speaking. Obviously, we can find exceptions to that, and depends on how we define that. But there is not a lot of overlap. They operate using different languages. There are different priorities, different incentives, different time frames for how work gets done. Incentives are a real challenge, especially in academia, where what we're rewarded on is publication of peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters and books. You know, we're not rewarded for Farmer John making a good decision about drought management on his land. And then how we do research, where we tend to isolate ourselves and separate ourselves from the world in order to isolate an experiment or isolate the problem, is actually counterintuitive to how we want to do research to produce relevant information. Next slide. So what do we know what works? There has been a lot of research on usable science, actionable research, transdisciplinary research. I could go on. There are other phrases we could use to describe this. So we have a really good understanding of what works. And the first and most important thing is identify the user's information needs. What exactly is the problem that they're trying to solve? How is the problem characterized? What is the scale? Who's involved in making decisions about it? How does their bureaucracy work in terms of making decisions and adopting policies? So identifying information needs is an absolute must. The conversation has to be two ways. It's not simply communicating science to society. It has to be iterative, and there has to be an engagement process between researchers and decision makers that's ongoing. Probably what surprises a lot of people is hearing how important trust and respect are in terms of developing useful scientific information. This goes back to legitimacy as one of the three characteristics of useful information. And trust is a huge factor. The users have to trust you as an individual or trust your organization, trust your unit, maybe trust your boss. Once trust is earned and gained, what we would call social capital, this trust can be used and leveraged as a way of pursuing research and identifying users' needs that is more likely to produce useful information. And finally, you have to manage the science-society boundary. So there's an advantage of science being separate from society, and that it can avoid politicization, being politicized. So you want some distance. You also want to avoid policy problems being scientized, if you will, turned into simple scientific problems. So what we do is we manage this boundary. It's sort of a dance. And so you want science to get close enough to society where we know their needs, we develop relationships, we communicate, but you also want enough separation so that science is not viewed as having been co-opted by the policy problem at hand. So those are the things that we know what works. There's been a lot of research that says this is what works. Next question, or next slide, sorry. So what's really important to take home here is that it's not about increasing the flow of information from science to society. It's not about doing more research. That's often how people respond, right? It's like, oh, well, we've got to solve the problem. Let's do more research. Well, that's not the solution. The solution is about getting the science right and doing the right science to begin with. Next slide. So some people, when we hear about shaping research, should we shape research? Isn't it supposed to be, research supposed to be unfettered by practical demands? You know, if we look at Vannevar Bush in 1945 in his essay, Science, the Endless Frontier, he makes a really strong case that science should be independent from society and should be left on its own to function as its own culture, its own rules of engagement, et cetera. And so the thought of shaping research is anathema to a lot of people when we talk about science. So the question is, should we shape research, and can we? And Jeff, go ahead to the next slide. And I would say that we already do. We already do in all kinds of situations. Directed research, directed applied research. We shape research by shaping the calls for proposals that we put out, the RFPs. So we're constantly responding to individual and group goals and preferences about the kind of research we should do. So really what we need to do is just shape research in a way that will help us solve discrete problems. Next slide. So one way to think of doing usable science is to think of science on a spectrum, with science values on one side, typically the values of peer review or methodological rigor in the kind of work that you do. With user values on the other side being more about the use of the information itself. And when we look at basic, applied, and user-inspired research, we can see that basic and applied fall in the middle to the left-hand side, whereas user-inspired research falls on the right side. So a few of my colleagues and I spent some time thinking about this particular problem of how do we shape research. We know that when we're doing usable science, we want the research to be skewed a little more towards the right, reflect user values, than the left, science values. But this doesn't mean we want to lose science. We don't want to marginalize it, but it does need to be relevant. And so how do we get there? And we created a typology that looks at 3 primary activities of science, and then under each activity, 5 additional elements, if you will, that together describe science writ large. So go to the next slide. So the 3 primary activities of research of science is knowledge production, learning and engagement, and organizational and institutional processes. For example, with knowledge production, under knowledge production, we have to take into consideration expertise, disciplines, uncertainty. Do we try to reduce uncertainty, or do we try to manage uncertainty? And what are the goals for research? With learning and engagement, we have to think about how learning happens, how information is exchanged, how people participate in networks, and the importance of social capital, trust and respect. And then finally, we look at the organizational and institutional processes. So how accessible is the research organization? A lot of research organizations sit in the, in the ivory tower, far away from the users. They even sit in centers within institutes, within colleges, on campuses. So they're potentially hard to access if you're a user wanting to connect with research. We also look at output. The peer-reviewed publication is the primary output for basic research, but we have to expand what we think about in terms of output for usable science to include white papers and reports, and meetings, workshops, relationships built, things like that. Evaluation is different. Flexibility, how flexible are you to adjust your research agenda? Once you get your, in some cases, once you get your, your big NSF grant, there's not a lot you can do to change the research as you progress, but in some cases you can. And then finally, flexibility and boundary management. So what we believe is that we have, we're able to map out research, what it is, what it's doing, how it does it, where it happens, et cetera, as a way to better understand the research that we do. And the argument is that if we can better understand the research that we do, then we can better shape the research to be more responsive to users' needs, to the greater likelihood that we'll produce usable information. Next slide. So this is what, we go back to the spectrum of science values on the left and user values on the right. We can then take a look at these activities that I just mentioned and their attributes and look at them in terms of science values and in terms of user values. So for example, under knowledge production and expertise, the very first line, if it's more science values, it's very formal. If it's user values, it's very experiential. So chances are that if we were to go through and ask ourselves the research that we're doing, where does my research lie on the spectra, we would be able to create sort of a thumbprint, if you will, of your research and be able to have some dialogue about it and help us point it in different directions. So I did that with a project that I was on years ago, about a decade ago, in Indonesia, looking at agroforestry research. And the challenge at the time was that the government did not allow coffee trees to grow and forest plantations run by the government, forests that were designed to protect watersheds and preserve ecosystems along watersheds. Their argument was that, coffee trees aren't really trees, they're smaller, they're fruit trees, and they're just, it's coffee, it's not a tree. So the research question was, is a coffee tree a tree? Does it accomplish the same goals for watershed protection as the regular forest trees do? Jeff, next slide. So this is what we sort of came up with in terms of taking a thumbprint of this particular research project. For example, if you look at, this is a very discrete problem we're working on. So you want the information to be useful and usable. But when we look at the third line down under disciplinary focus, we asked, was it a single discipline or is it multidisciplinary? Well, it was actually pretty much a single discipline or two. Folks who study trees and could look at their effect on soil and water retention, things like that. So even though this was a very useful-oriented science project, when it comes to disciplinary focus, it's fairly far to the left. On the other hand, when you look at goals for research, the fifth line down, is it exploratory or is it outcome-oriented? Well, it's very outcome-oriented because the information that the decision makers receive will affect how they manage the forest. And so, the outcome of the research was that indeed coffee trees are trees. They function the same way, they preserve soil the same way, water flows very similarly through coffee lands as it does with regular forested lands, et cetera. So what we can do with a thumbprint like this is start a conversation, dialogue about, are we doing the research the right way? Do we have enough social capital in the work that we're doing? Accessibility looks kind of low. Is it too low? Do we need to do something to allow more interaction with users? Network participation was relatively low. Do we need to change that? On the other hand, boundary management at the very bottom is high. Is it high enough? Does it need to be higher? Or are we over managing the boundary in a situation that doesn't call for such management? So together, what we can do with this typology is help us have conversations about the research we do, deliberate about it, and eventually make decisions about how to conduct our research. Next slide. So in conclusion, we need to think about how we do research, being more intentional with the design of research, and then design research with the end in mind. And I believe that the typology that I just introduced is one tool that can help us get there. Next slide. And that's it. So I'll be happy to answer questions that you may have.
Great, thanks a lot, Beth. This is Jeff, then maybe. So this is a combined call of our joint stakeholder committee meeting and the monthly check-in. So this is an opportunity for those two groups to sort of maybe overlap a little bit. One of the things we ask on the monthly check-in is for every funded investigator to dial in to the monthly check-in. So I'll take advantage of that group being on the call and ask, in terms of in prep for our 5-year review, do we think we could put the 3 from 2013, the 5 from 2015, and the 3 foundational science areas, the projects that we funded, would they be amenable to getting a questionnaire and say, kind of give yourself a score between A and E with each of these components? Is that something, to me, I could see an appendix that does this type of graphic for each of the 8 plus the 3 foundational science areas that we have funded. And maybe Bets could comment if that would be ill-advised, or does that kind of make sense? Do you do this self kind of evaluated? Does this come from outside? And then to the group, the funded investigators, is this something that they could see themselves answering without too much challenge?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a neat idea, and I think it's it would take about 10 minutes to run through the questionnaire to help answer the questions. You can self-administer. It's not very difficult. But I think the real issue is, not just to do it for the sake of doing it, but what do you do with it afterwards? And providing some analysis or insight into the research. I think that's where the richness of it would come out, is if you, take it to the next step and really show how, your self-inquiry, your research brings about greater understanding of the research that you do. So connecting it to some kind of self-reflection, I think, would be great.
Yeah, I can see where that would be. We have to work with Bets as well as others to, how you use the information. I think it would be, I think it's promising enough that we could ask for the information and we could kind of then sit back and reflect on how best to use it. I would add the note that I don't think there's anything I guess I would be normative or punitive about putting dots that might fall along one axis or another. In fact, a spread would probably be legitimate when you look at a funding portfolio. So I at least at this stage, I don't see anything as far as, kind of saying something's better or worse because the dots are more aligned on a right or left. But I think it would be good to collect and then think about moving forward with kind of like, where people fall. And even you could think about solicitations that ask people to propose where they think they're going to fall in that along the spectrum with these attributes.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make, that that lower, putting dots closer to A versus E is not inherently better. It depends on the situation. Like I said with the Indonesian case study, the disciplinary focus was very narrow, but that was the nature of the research question that was being investigated, and that was an appropriate response for that. So it's, there are times when you might look at it and say, I think we do need more disciplines, or we're putting a lot of effort in social capital when really it doesn't need that much effort. So maybe instead of having social capital at E, it's better at D or C for this particular case. So I think that that's really important to understand, is that these are thumbprints and not a call for all research to be located at the far right end of the spectrum. That just wouldn't work.
Right. I mean, I could imagine, if I see a project and it's mainly along the left-hand side, then maybe it's sort of making sure there's management. We follow up to see if there's a management application that could take advantage of that more fundamental research. If something's more along the right-hand side, it's like, well, is there a training module that could describe this activity because it was really well attuned with some management action, and the next step would be to kind of share that information. So I could see where a given project, and depending where it falls, would be like kind of how you use that information and your expectations from that information.
Yeah, it's the rubber meets the road in what you do with that thumbprint once you've developed it.
Let me just open it up to see if any of the funded investigators on the line have any consternation or heartburn if they get if they're asked to sort of give us an A through E for their projects over the next month or so. Is that kind of with I think this is published, yes, Bets?
Yeah, we have a paper out. It's sort of a wonky paper. It was written for research policy, but we've been administering this typology to a number of different groups. So we're actually using it. We've refined it. We've refined the questionnaire. So it's this part of it is not very wonky, but the paper sort of is.
Okay, but I think it's good to have that reference in case people want to know exactly what you meant by these attributes, and you can dig into it a bit. So given that you'd have that kind of cheat sheet paper to go along with it, I would ask the funded investigators to watch for that. Can you use the microphone? Oh, sorry, I didn't know where it was. Hold on, we're getting Ursula a microphone so everyone on the phone can hear her question or comment.
We did a Usable Science 101 workshop, and we did this, and it was the whole workshop was only 3 hours, and so we were able to do this in maybe 20 minutes, and that's stepping through all the questions and giving people time to think about it, so it doesn't take days and days to do.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing that was interesting about that is that two researchers who were in the same unit researching the same thing, collaborating with each other, had some very different answers about where they placed the dots. And, this was a source of conversation for them to try to understand why they had such divergent responses to some of these attributes. And, in the end, they realized that their answers were different and that was okay that they were very different because of the way that they were approaching their particular slice of that research problem. So, it's not looking for some normative answer, but really a way to spur conversation and dialogue.
Great, yeah, and I could see the review panel, having this in front of them with the projects that we funded, just to kind of lead that discussion or to facilitate a dialogue about kind of how we're doing actionable science.
Yeah.
Anyway, big fan of this typology. Let me see if there's any other questions before we dig into any updates from the foundational science areas. Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Bets, and also appreciate your helping us with in prep for our review. So Dennis has.
Yeah.
Oh, Dennis has a question.
Okay.
Yeah, Bets. It seems that in looking at some of these criteria that there would be a mixture, in a sense, for an effective project, and looking at expertise, for instance, you would want a mixture of kind of cross-formal and informal, looking at some of the reductions events. Well, that's probably the social capital, looking at a mixture within your team of within science and outside science. So I guess looking at a single dot for a project maybe doesn't represent the type of richness that a team might represent. So you do this as an individual, or how do you do it as a team?
Well, I think in doing it as a team, it forces you to have a dialogue. So that's where the richness comes in, is deciding as a team where you put your dots. But usually what I would do is have individuals in the team do it, and then have them compare notes afterwards to see, where they think that the dots would go for the overall project. And you're right, it's like if you've got 5 people on a research project, social capital might be of significant importance to 1 or 2 people. Social capital outside of science might be very important. For others, it may be more important within science. So you could get a significant variability by asking members of the team what they think. But the challenge and the richness comes in the discussion afterwards of trying to figure out, well, as a project, what does this project look like? I mean, yes, it's your slice of the project has very formal expertise, but overall, it's still, we're still very interested in experiential expertise. So, where do we compromise and put the dot? So that's the challenge. But I would start with the individuals and then aggregate them into a team level.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Beth, this is Imtiaz. I was wondering if, because you have asked us to do something like this for projects, I'm wondering did you ask us to do it for the Wind River project? And so maybe we have already, what I'm asking is basically the NCCSC folks have already kind of involved with this work. But the other question was, when I did this in the past with some of the projects I've been involved with Western Water and maybe CSC, is so kind of the point you were talking about earlier is where we put the dots, and should we put it at C or B or D? That's been very qualitative, and it's been helpful. As you say, it just helps the conversation. But that has been a bit of an issue that comes up when we're working with something like this.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't take long to kind of finish this. That was the other comment I wanted to make.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah, one of the interesting findings from the Wind River group was how different social science looked from the natural or physical sciences, where they put their dots. But that reflects the kind of research that's being done. So, yeah, it was. We did that with the Wind River group.
Yeah, thanks for confirming.
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions for Bets?
All right. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And my contact information is up there, so I'd be happy to talk more about it with any of you. If you have questions or if you'd like a copy of the paper, feel free to get in touch with me.
Great, thank you very much. And I'll ask the PIs to watch for, maybe I'll just send that PowerPoint with the yellow dots, and you guys can slide them around how you think, where you think they ought to be on that graphic, and we'll have the information and graphics ready to go for the 5-year review.
Sweet. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Much obliged. Thanks, Beth.
All right.
Okay, so what we'll do is dig into the foundational science areas. Any updates from those? Maybe MTS, we'll start with you. We'll go around to physical, and then the impact with Andy, and then Dennis and Jill can chime in on that. But let's start with MTS and try to keep it to about 5 minutes. We're hoping to end on the hour. So hand it over to you, MTS.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. We can talk about a few things we've been involved with, and Candida is here, so she can go into a bit of detail with those. I'll start with saying that we have been talking about having this tool developed where we can provide historical eddy data for any region, if you get a shapefile or any rectangular coordinates or point location. So we have the tool in place, the routine in place to help out any request that comes from within the NCCSC or outside. And ultimately, we'd like to host that whole thing on a website so the user can work with it directly. But for now, we are helping out. We're just kind of working with people who already made the request in the past and giving them this data set. So just wanted to point out that, yes, we have the historical data from 1980 to current. These are eddy data that you can use for research purposes. And eddy is is one of the drought indicator metric, working with potential evapotranspiration. So I'll let Candida talk about some of the work she's been doing with kind of firstly revising the PET paper on which we got the comments back from reviewers, and she's going to AGU fall meeting and presenting her new work. So, Candida.
Hi. So just a quick update. I'm working with evaluating the MACA data set, which is downscaled projections using CMIP5 models. I started the work with 4, potentially 5 global climate models, and they're downscaled versions over the U.S. So I'm comparing how metrics of drought indices, starting with potential evapotranspiration, I'm comparing spatial patterns of means and variability in both the coarse resolution model and the downscaled version to assess if the variability and the magnitudes are bias-corrected and well-represented, keeping the features from the coarse resolution models if the projected versions are faithfully represented by the downscaled versions. And we're also going to be looking at differences between future and historical periods to assess changes in drought risk according to different models to get a sense of spread and scenarios and so on. So I'll be presenting that at AGU if anybody is going. I have a poster on Tuesday morning. So yeah, would be happy to chat more if you're there.
I guess that's kind of it. If there are any questions.
Yeah, good. And I think that maybe, I don't know, Jill, if you could take an action on any AGU work, and I don't know if it's being coordinated at the CSC level. This is always something that we end up sort of like, kind of wanting to have a summary of everything that's going on at AGU across the CSC network. And so if anyone is sending things to AGU or participating in AGU, could you send a note to Jill? Would that be all right? Jill's nodding along, so we can do that. And I don't know, I haven't seen anything from the national office on that, but maybe we might just be a little ahead of them. But let's get our ducks in a row. So if anybody's going to AGU and presenting anything, please send Jill a note. And yeah, we'll make sure and manage that when they do, if and when they do ask us for that. Great, thanks a lot, MTS and Candida. And I think that MACA data set is going to be generally interest across a lot of folks on the call. So curious to see how that analysis turns out. Maybe I'll hand it over to Andy and Arjun with the Ecological Impacts Group.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Hi, everybody. Andy here. Maybe I can open, and Arjun, you could come in here in a minute. On our core foundational science project, we're continuing to do exploratory analyses that relate to water balance and different ways to formulate it. Looking particularly at different ways that potential evapotranspiration can be estimated with the MACA data, allowing the more sophisticated methodologies, and then applying that across the domain with the help of MTS and Candidus, trying to see to what extent the estimates of PET differ for the historic period under these different methods, and how they differ in space, but eastern part of the system to the drier western part. And then we're looking at to what extent do species distribution models for various tree species differ when you use the variables that include the more sophisticated water balance versus less so. And then finally, you apply those species distribution models under projected future climate. Do you get different answers for the area of suitable habitat and the location of that? We'll look forward to sharing at some point before too long some of our findings on that. Some interesting stuff's coming out, but it's a little too early to talk much about it yet. So Arjun's been leading that work. Would you care to share other details on that, Arjun?
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Hansen. This is Arjun, and yeah, we are making some progress on this issue. Yes, we are trying to see whether there is any difference in water balance value estimated by different methods, for example, using Penman, Monteith equations, and particularly Thornwright type equation. The difference was just people think they showed Penman Monteith equation estimated more reliable values of PET, but and there is over estimation of PET by Thorne-White equation. People showed that, but in our analysis, the Thorne-White, the value of the equations or the methods estimated for PET depends on the geographical area, and there is a huge difference in this Yellowstone area. That means there is Thorne-White equation predicted lower PET than Penman equations, but the difference narrows down when you go to the tropical areas or subtropical areas still. But in tropical areas, I found the secondary literature that the Penman PET value is higher than Thorne-White PET value. And finally, what we decided, let's see how it differs in habitat distribution. So here, what I found was, I compared 3 sets of data sets. The first one we call the traditional data set using precipitation and temperature to predict the habitat. And the second one is the traditional data set plus water balance data set estimated by Penman equation. And the third one is traditional data set plus water balance data set estimated by Thorne-White equations. So I took 4 different species in 4 different geographical locations. One is from this dry area of high mountain, greater Yellowstone area. The second one is from the northern part of Great Plain. The third one is the high humid Wisconsin and Great Lake area, and the third one is again the dry area of North Texas, Kansas, and the Tennessee area. So I found that for those species, there is no difference in model. There is no difference, fundamentally no difference on the basis of model accuracy, confusion matrix, and area under curve value. But there is slightly difference in the total habitat projection. The projection that ends up with difference in 5 to 15% area projection of those species. This is for the current prediction, and right now I'm running the model for the future habitat prediction under 2 scenarios using the same 3 sets of data sets. And I can present this result in the next monthly check-in. And the message from this, the quick summary is that we can use all 3 types of data set to predict habitat modeling or habitat of the species wherever they are available. And the second, this is the current, and the other on top of this progress, I made some progress on metadata production of our project, and I'm in continuous contact with Leanne, so that she has sent me the corrected version of my first metadata, potential metadata, or the what you call the example or sample, and I'm about to send her the corrected version again within this week. Okay, that is from my side.
Let me just
Andy, again, just very briefly, I'll mention that relative to our interesting talk here in this session on linking science and management, we just concluded basically doing a final assessment with our management collaborators on our climate change and the Great Northern LCC project. So we did a pre-study survey, pre-project survey with the managers, and then a post-project survey. And it was just really, really interesting to see over that 5-year period in what ways the collaboration was quite highly successful and in what ways it really didn't work very well at all. So I think the points that Beth made were really interesting and just really highly relevant to what we're up to, I think most of us are up to here with the Climate Science Center. Okay, sorry to take so much time. Thanks for listening.
Oh, thanks, Andy and Arjun. And let me just ask to make sure that water balance stuff is Gabriel is aware of that and working at least in somewhat coordination. Not to put you on the spot, Gabriel.
Yeah, when we were down with you all in Fort Collins, we talked with Gabriel about this at some length, and then he and Dennis and MTS and I sort of, put forth the hope that we would do a workshop on this topic in the coming spring. So he's pretty directly in the loop.
Great, and I apologize for my not knowing that a little bit better, but glad to hear, and Gabriel's kind of nodding along, so that sounds well coordinated and appreciated. Why don't I hand it over to Dennis to dig into the adaptation?
We can't hear anything if anything is being said at this point.
Sorry, folks, hold on. We're making sure the microphone, and you could maybe just come up here if you want to just make sure that they can be heard. So here's Dennis.
So recently, about 3 weeks ago, Steve Daly-Larson invited me to talk about some of the aspects of the joint activities between the Climate Science Center and the USDA Hub and how that relates to co-production and actionable science. And that was, he chairs a board for the that's called the National Agricultural Research Extension Economics, Education and Economics Advisory Board, so it's a fairly high-level board that was here dealing with climate change issues. So that was really useful. Shannon McNeely now is headed up to Montana today to actually participate in a drought workshop, continuing the efforts within the sort of this overarching area for us, the drought risk adaptation in the interior, which includes the Wind River Project and a couple other things that we're doing, looking at sort of the socio-ecological aspects of drought. And that's been very useful. And the Wind River Project itself, which is really a joint effort among Western Water, the Northern Great Plains Hub, NIDIS, and other groups, has been very effective and pointed out as a really strong example of this co-production type of effort. And really sort of proud that we were able to be part of that and help lead that. We're also continuing efforts with various partners looking at how this co-production can be better incorporated. And so Jeff and David Anderson organized a meeting on campus with our Dean of Natural Resources, where we had partners from TNC, an example from our Southwest Colorado project, which they were involved with Colorado Parks and Wildlife Division, where we sort of shared stories about how this co-production engagement was really critical of building the trust, of making sure that the research was more actionable, and thinking about how we might look at extending what we're doing in this state, and we also had Colorado BLM, to other states and some of these similar entities in Wyoming, Montana, Kansas, and what have you, North and South Dakota, to see how we might build out what we're doing here in Colorado to, across the region. Mention also that the efforts within the National Adaptation Forum is moving forward. The sessions are being selected, so keep in tune. If you have any questions, contact Shannon McNeely about that. And then just the last comment of just reminding all of us to get our technical inputs into the current National Climate Assessment. We have, I think, until January to do that, but I think there's a lot of useful material that we have to really share to build the Northern Great Plains Regional Assessment. Rich Conant here at Colorado State University is is the lead coordinating author for that. Doug Pluck out of NOAA is sort of the federal coordinator. So if you have any questions, contact them, or you can contact us, and we'll pass that information on. So that's what I'll wrap up with that. Jeff?
Thanks. Any questions on any of the three foundational science areas? And I do echo that Dave Anderson, Colorado Natural Heritage Program was pretty interesting. In addition to what Dennis mentioned, I have on my list of things to do is to reach out to the different natural heritage programs within our region as a possible liaison with the Fish and Wildlife agencies, that they typically sit at land-grant institutions, are aware of climate, understand the sensitivities and the political kind of dynamics of the Fish and Wildlife agencies in their state. So I think as an example of what we did with Colorado Natural Heritage Program, we'll be exploring that with other natural heritage programs in throughout the region. Any other questions? And Andy, I'm handing out your Climate Change and Wildlands books to the folks here in the room. So we appreciate getting that, and that sort of work from the Ecological Impacts Group as well as NASA funding that we're proud of, and we'll have copies to bring to that 5-year review. Dennis has a question for Andy.
Andy, what's the status of the Montana climate assessment, and how much of the adaptation work is included related to the North Central Climate Science Center stuff?
I think the assessment is nearly done. I actually haven't been involved with it. Kathy Whitlock just mentioned that they're making good progress. They continue to work with Tom Armstrong on coming up with ways to try to deliver knowledge to stakeholders as somewhat of a follow-up to the climate assessment. So they see it as a model that they'd like to additionally do socioeconomic analysis for. But again, the CSC work is not really directly involved with that assessment. I think just due to how Kathy decided to distribute workload among people in the IOE.
Okay, thanks.
All right, well, we're at the top of the hour, so I appreciate everybody hanging in there. Appreciate Bets for an engaging talk. I think it's very relevant as we look at how we do our 5-year review and move forward. Thanks to the foundational areas. Thanks for all the funded PIs for joining. I noticed the spreadsheet was fairly up to date. Didn't see any demands from the foundational science areas for any of the projects this month, but feel free to follow up amongst yourselves as needed. We'll stop there. For folks joining the Joint Stakeholder Committee, we'll plan to reconvene at 1:30 at this number and this WebEx. So with that, we'll sign off and appreciate people joining. We'll talk to the joint stakeholders in an hour and a half.